Wolfratshausen is the kind of Bavarian town where the church bells are the loudest thing all week. Half an hour south of Munich. Timber balconies, geraniums, the Loisach River running green under the bridges. On the last Friday of July 1983, just after noon, two men opened the door of a backyard garage at Sauerlacherstrasse No. 1, and the quiet of the town changed its meaning. Inside, between a printing press and the wall, lay a heavy man of 56. He had run sales for the biggest oil company in communist Europe. Someone had fired at least 8 shots at him. 5 or 6 had struck. The right hand, both arms, the back of the head. And the shots were not the end of it. Before the killers left, one of them had swung a blade into his skull. An axe-like blade, the kind of tool a court would one day describe as probably a butcher's cleaver. Nothing was stolen. The manuscripts he had carried in were still on the floor beside him, and the lock on the door was untouched. Whoever had waited for him in the dark of that garage had not broken in. They had been let in, or they had a key. The Bavarian police wrote down that detail and could take it no further. Answering it would take 33 years, the death of the country that wanted him dead, and a courtroom 30 kilometers up the road. And before the answer came, an entire nation would rewrite its own laws 3 days before joining the European Union, because of what happened in this garage. The dead man's name was Stjepan Đureković. He was born in 1926 in Bukovac, a village near Petrovaradin, in the flat Danube country where Croatia, Serbia and Hungary blur into one another. He came of age inside the new socialist Yugoslavia and learned its first lesson early. The system rewarded the men it trusted. He studied economics in Belgrade, ran commerce at a metal factory in Osijek before he was 30, moved up through the oil refinery at Sisak, and when Yugoslavia consolidated its oil industry into one giant called INA in 1964, he rose with it. By the 1970s, he was the marketing director of INA's trading arm in Zagreb, the man who moved the country's fuel. It was one of those socialist positions that appeared on no chart of power and sat near the center of it anyway. He saw what the refineries produced and what the country actually had. He saw the import contracts and the foreign currency that paid for them. He knew, down to the storage tank, the numbers a nervous state keeps to itself. The system trusted him, and it paid. The cottage on the island of Kruk, the speedboat, the salary. The journalist Denis Kuljic, who later reconstructed his life, described a man flush with money, drinking hard, in a marriage that had gone quiet. Then Tito died in May 1980, and the country began living on borrowed money and borrowed time. Fuel queues appeared. The currency slid. For most Yugoslavs, the crisis was rumor and inconvenience. For the man who moved the fuel, it was a spreadsheet he could recite from memory. On the 23rd of April 1982, Stjepan Đureković got into a car in Zagreb and did not come to work again. He was 55. He did not travel alone. With him went his secretary, 19 years old. Kuljic, who told that part of the story, gave her only a first name and an initial. They crossed into Austria, spent 2 weeks on Tenerife, and by the end of May, he was in Munich. His exit broke no law. There were no charges, no warrant, no chase. He simply left with whatever he had banked and whatever he carried in his head. His wife Gisela, his colleague at INA for decades, learned what had happened the way the state did, slowly. 5 weeks passed before she filed a missing person report. Their only son, Damir, was already gone. He had slipped out of Yugoslavia the summer before to get clear of the army. Father and son found each other in Munich and shared the exile. West Germany granted him political asylum that October. And then the Quiet Oil executive did something nobody in Zagreb had planned for. He started writing. 8 books in about 18 months. A novel called I, Josip Broz Tito. A tract called Communism, the Great Fraud. Red Managers, about the elite he had belonged to. How Yugoslavia robs Croatia, about where the money went. He named names, villas, habits. And he wrote about the one subject he knew better than any exile alive, the oil. In December 1982, he gave interviews saying out loud what his spreadsheets had whispered, that Yugoslavia's petroleum reserves were dangerously thin and where the military kept its fuel. In a state that expected the world to fall on it, that was not commentary. That was inventory. In Zagreb, files were opened on him. His books were classified as hostile works. The machine that had trusted him began, formally and on paper, to work against him. What happened next belongs to a longer ledger. Since the 1960s, at least 30 Croatian exiles had been murdered on West German soil. Shot in stairwells, in parked cars, through kitchen windows. When the case finally reached a courtroom decades later, a Berlin newspaper called it the longest unsolved murder series in the history of the Federal Republic. Emigre researchers count 60 or more across Western Europe. The victims had one thing in common. They were loud, in print or in politics, against Belgrade. The exiles had a name for the thing that was killing them. The UDBA, the Yugoslav State Security, a secret police that did not treat borders as a reason to stop. In 1978, the emigre journalist Bruno Bušić was shot dead in a Paris doorway. No one was ever convicted. The pattern repeated across a decade, a professional job, no usable witnesses, an investigation that started loud and went nowhere. West German officials of that era have been accused, in documentaries and in Parliament, of not looking very hard. Yugoslavia was a trading partner, a supplier of workers, a buffer between the blocs, and the dead were foreigners with complicated politics. Whatever the reason, the arithmetic stood: 30 bodies, 0 convictions. Munich, home of the largest Croatian exile community, was the center of the hunting ground. And in 1982, into that city, walked the man who had just published where the fuel depots were. The Croatian National Committee, one of the old Munich exile organizations, gave Đureković the 2 things he needed most: a platform and a printing press. The press lived in a rented backyard garage in Wolfratshausen, half an hour south of the city. It printed the committee's newspaper, and now it printed his books. For a man who believed, correctly, that he was being hunted, the garage was better than an office. It was a place almost nobody knew existed. The man who ran it was Krunoslav Prates, an exile of the older generation, a fixture of the committee, an editor of its newspaper in Bavaria since the 60s. He set the type, he kept the keys, he handled the practical world so that the writers could write. He and Đureković saw each other constantly. Prates would say later, in a courtroom, that Đureković was frightened and lived like a conspirator. He was one of the few people the frightened man did not seem frightened of. In the summer of 1983, Đureković decided to stand for election to the Croatian National Council, the exiles' umbrella body. Then a fake interview surfaced in the emigre press, under his name, announcing he would not run. It was a forgery, planted to cut him out of exile politics, and he treated it as one. He sat down and wrote a 3-page answer. Why I am a candidate. On the last Thursday of July, he drove to Wolfratshausen to print it. It was meant to be a short errand on a full day. The manuscript lay on the seat beside him. For the afternoon, there was a plan to take the boat out with his girlfriend. He parked at Sauerlacher Strasse No. 1, walked to the garage he trusted, and unlocked the door. They were waiting for him inside, in the dark of the back section, between the machines. At least 8 shots were fired. 5 or 6 struck him. The right hand, both upper arms, the back of the head. The autopsy found 2 kinds of bullets from 2 different guns, a Czech-made pistol, and what the examiners took for a small caliber Beretta. 2 shooters, firing from behind. Then a third man stepped in and finished it with the blade. The blows opened his skull. He was dead within minutes, on the floor of the room where his books were made, the candidacy statement still with him. The killers walked out into a Bavarian summer afternoon and vanished. They left a single sneaker print and nothing else. At noon the next day, Krunoslav Prates and his brother opened the garage and found him. A week later, Prates stood among the mourners at the Munich funeral. The Bavarian homicide men worked the scene and hit the wall within hours. The lock. No damage. No forced entry. The men who waited in the dark had entered with a key, and every key to that garage was supposed to be accounted for. Somewhere, a copy existed. The question of who made it and whose hand carried it would outlive almost everyone in this story. The West German press said the quiet part immediately. This looked like Belgrade's work. The investigators privately assumed the same. It changed nothing. The suspects who mattered lived behind a border where German warrants were paper. The exiled community pointed fingers in every direction, including inward. Everyone knew the service liked to live inside the émigré organizations, and nobody could say where. Leads thinned. The reward notices yellowed. Damir Đureković telephoned his mother in Zagreb the evening after the discovery to tell her that her husband was dead. He buried his father in Munich, and then he did what the son of a murdered defector does. He concluded he might be next and put an ocean between himself and Europe. By 1984, he was in Calgary, in Western Canada, building a cleaning business and, friends said, planning to finish his father's unfinished books. Years accumulated. The garage went back to being a garage. In Munich, the file number stayed active, passed from desk to desk, a Cold War cold case waiting for the Cold War to end. The detectives never got to ask the only question that mattered. What exactly did this man know that was worth 2 guns, a blade, and a copied key? Exiles had written angry books for 40 years without earning a 3-man team. Books alone do not explain it. What made Đureković different was not what he said about the system. It was what he had taken out of it, and what he had been inside it. Start with the part a German court would one day establish as fact. From April 1975 until January 1983, Stjepan Đureković, the marketing director of Yugoslavia's oil giant, was a paid informant of the BND, West Germany's foreign intelligence service. Recruited while he still sat in his Zagreb office. Paid at least 150,000 marks. He passed economic intelligence, and he passed military intelligence. The state of the oil reserves, the fuel infrastructure, the numbers a country keeps for war. The exile hero of the Munich scene had been bondsman inside INA for 8 years. He arrived in Germany with roughly 500,000 marks spread across accounts in 3 countries. And his file at the BND was closed in January 1983, 6 months before the garage. Nothing in the record explains why. Kuljish, the journalist, went one step darker. Money like that, he wrote, tends to come from one place in a socialist economy, and it is not a salary. He raised, and could not prove, the possibility that Đureković had also been on the books of the Yugoslav service itself. A man run by both sides, who finally ran for one of them. Years later, an ex-agent of that service would claim under oath that the service had steered the defection from the start. No court has ever found that. What the court did find was narrower and stranger. The service knew exactly who he was and wanted him not just discredited, but gone. Then there is the second layer, the one the written verdict carries. Among the things Đureković knew about were financial dealings inside INA's oil trade, dealings the court connected to the name Vanja Špiljak, the son of Mika Špiljak, the Croatian party grandee, who, in the very summer of the murder, held the rotating presidency of Yugoslavia itself. The court's finding was deliberately narrow. Đureković was eliminated, in part, as a witness to the son's alleged business. Alleged and never proven. Vanja Špiljak himself testified in Munich decades later. He had never met the man. The embezzlement stories had been launched against him by Yugoslavia's Federal Interior Chief, Stjepan Đureković, and the court's own experts, going through the books, found no embezzlement at all. Both things sit in the same verdict. A court that named his knowledge as a motive, and testimony that the crimes he was supposed to have witnessed may never have happened. And while he wrote his books, the state was writing one about him. In July 1982, the Croatian branch of the service formally approved a campaign to discredit him. That October, it opened a special file. In April 1983, at a closed session of the federal body that oversaw state security, it was claimed that Đureković had embezzled $8 million from INA. The German court, 33 years later, examined that claim and called it unfounded. A corruption file, manufactured about a man the service was preparing to kill. 10 weeks after that meeting, he was dead. In 1989, the wall came down. In 1991, Yugoslavia began to die, loudly, in the wars everyone remembers. The republic that had watched Đureković hardest became an independent Croatia, at war from its first breath. The old state security dissolved, its buildings changed signs, its files changed owners, and many of its men changed employers without changing trades. A new state under embargo needed exactly the skills the old service had taught. Some of its best organizers helped build the new country's intelligence agencies. The past was not examined closely. There was a war on. But German reunification had opened archives that were never meant to open, and in them, and in the files leaking out of dead Yugoslavia, German prosecutors found the Wolfratshausen case looking back at them. Through the 90s, the Munich file quietly thickened. Old telephone records, travel movements, payment trails, the pattern of calls between a Bavarian suburb and one particular building in Zagreb. In 2005, 22 years after the murder, it moved. Bavarian police took a man into custody. Krunoslav Prates, the committee's printer, the man who had found the body. And a German court issued an arrest warrant for a second man in Zagreb, whose name the German public had never heard, and whose surrender Croatia would spend nearly a decade refusing. The Perković case reached its verdict in Munich in the summer of 2008, and it rewrote the story of the garage from the first page. Since the early 1970s, the court found the helpful printer of the exile press had been an informant of the Croatian state security. Croatian reporting gives the code names in his file as Boem and Steve. His standing instructions report on the émigrés and call Zagreb every 2 weeks. When the oil executive arrived in Munich in 1982, Perković reported it the very next day. Every visit, every book, every plan that passed through the print shop passed on to Zagreb. And in early June 1983, in Luxembourg, Perković handed his handler a duplicate key to the Wolfratshausen garage. He told Zagreb when Đureković would come to print his candidacy statement. On the day of the murder itself, the records showed contact between the printer and his handler. The men in the dark never needed to break in. The friend with the keys had opened the door for them weeks in advance, in another country. Then he found the body, with his own brother beside him. He stood at the funeral, and on the day of that funeral, Krunoslav Prates flew with his brothers to Mallorca, where he met his handler again, days after the killing. For 22 years afterward, he lived as a respected elder of the exile press he had spent his adult life informing on. The court gave him life imprisonment. At the trial of his handlers years later, he would take it all back, and the court would not believe him. The sentence stood, and it carried a larger fact inside it. The service that had lost an insider had used an insider to take him back. But Perković was the instrument, not the will. The file, the phone numbers, the Luxembourg meeting, all of it pointed up to the man on the other end of the line. And the man on the other end of the line had a name, a rank, and by 2008, remarkably, a career. His name was Josip Perković. In 1983, he ran Department 2 of the Croatian State Security, the desk assigned to what the files called the hostile emigration. He was the handler in Luxembourg. He was the Zagreb end of the every 2 weeks calls. Above him sat Zdravko Mustač, the head of the Croatian service itself. And the operation against Stjepan Đureković had a code name in the files: Dunav, the Danube. Reconstructed from the paper, the machine worked like this. July 1982, the discreditation campaign is approved by Mustač. October, the special file opens. December 1982, a written service decision, and through that winter, in the judge's later words, the order to prepare the assassination. April 1983. The $8 million story is planted at the Federal Council by Mustač. By early June, the decision is final, and the key changes hands in Luxembourg. Weapons move through the Yugoslav state shipping agency, Jadro Agent. A female operative in Munich handles logistics. On the 28th of July, the machine closes its circuit. The men in the garage appear nowhere in the paperwork. The paperwork only ever named the men who sent them. In 2009, German warrants went out for Mustač and 3 more former officers. By then, the reason Zagreb would not surrender anyone had become the story itself. After independence, Josip Perković had not fled and had not hidden. He had helped build the new Croatia's intelligence services, served through the war years near the center of the state's secret machinery, and retired on a state pension. His son would later serve as a national security advisor in the president's office. The Germans were not asking Croatia to hand over a fugitive. They were asking it to hand over a founder. By 2013, Croatia had done the improbable, survived its war, rebuilt, negotiated for a decade, and arrived at the door of the European Union. Accession Day was set for the 1st of July. Fireworks were ordered for Zagreb. And then, days before the flags went up, the Croatian parliament amended its law on the European arrest warrant. No one would be surrendered for crimes committed before August 2002. The press had a name for the amendment within hours: Lex Perković, the Perković Law. The reaction was not subtle. Chancellor Angela Merkel cancelled her attendance at Zagreb's accession celebration. Berlin said the two things were unconnected. The European Justice Commissioner Viviane Reding demanded repeal. Brussels began preparing sanctions against a country that had been a member for 1 month. Croatia had spent 10 years earning its way into Europe, and its first act inside was to shield 2 secret police pensioners from a German murder warrant. In October 2013, Zagreb folded. The amendment was repealed, effective the 1st of January 2014. On New Year's morning, both men were arrested at home. Josip Perković was extradited on the 24th of January on a scheduled flight to Munich. Zdravko Mustač followed in the spring. 30 years after Operation Dunav, the 2 men who had run the Croatian state security sat in German remand cells, and the garage in Wolfratshausen finally had its trial. It opened on the 17th of October 2014 in Munich's high-security justice complex before Judge Manfred Dauster. 133 journalists were accredited for the first day. In the dock, 2 men in their 70s who had once commanded a secret police following Bavarian court German through interpreters. The trial was scheduled to run for months. It ran for almost 2 years, 44 witnesses, and it turned into a parade of an entire buried world. Praetz was brought from prison as a witness and recanted everything. The whole story, he now said, was made up. The court noted that he had once described the Luxembourg key handover to investigators in detail and declined to believe the new version. The defense told a different story altogether. The victim had been Bond's spy, and it was Yugoslav military counterintelligence, together with the Federal Service, that had him killed. The Croatian branch had nothing to do with it. The court heard that theory out, and in the verdict rejected it. And then there was Vinko Sindicic. In the mythology of the Yugoslav service, he is the travelling gunman, the name that surfaces near half the émigré graves in Europe. The provable record is narrower and matters. Convicted in Scotland in 1989 for the attempted murder of the exile Nikola Stedul, 15 years, of which he served about 10. Tried in Zagreb for the Paris murder of Bruno Bušić and acquitted in 2000. He has never been charged with anything in the Đureković case. As a witness in Munich, he behaved like a man allergic to courtrooms. He failed to appear twice until the presiding judge announced from the bench that Sindicic had been arrested in Spain on a Croatian warrant. In July 2016, he finally testified. Under oath, he named the killers of Stjepan Đureković, Branko Bijelić, a man who had died in 2004, and Luka Sekula, a Croat with Swedish citizenship, alive in Sweden. He named the men he said had selected the team and driven the shooter to Germany. He said a woman in Munich had handled the logistics. And he added one more thing, that he had been paid 13,000 euros to withdraw statements he had given earlier. The court listened to all of it and declared him unreliable. Another voice arrived by video link from Mostar, a former officer of the service, Ivan Lasic, who told the court the actual killer had been Arkan, the Belgrade underworld figure who would become the most infamous warlord of the Yugoslav wars. The court examined the Arkan theory too, and rejected it for lack of evidence. Names, claims, recantations. The trial had everything except a killer. The widow was there as well. Stjepan Đureković, in her 80s, joined the proceedings as a co-plaintiff. The woman who had filed a missing person report in 1982 got her answer in a Bavarian courtroom 34 years later. On Wednesday, the 3rd of August 2016, the court delivered it. Guilty, both. Josip Perković and Zdravko Mustač sentenced to life imprisonment over the murder of Stjepan Đureković 33 years and 6 days after the garage. The judge read the sentence and said the other thing out loud too. The men who fired the shots and swung the blade remain unidentified to this day. The appeals went up to Germany's Federal Court of Justice and died there in May 2018. The sentences were final. Then came the strangest chapter of the aftermath. Both men asked to serve their German life sentences at home, and the machinery of European law obliged. In July 2019, Perković landed in Zagreb on a scheduled flight from Munich. Mustač followed in November. Croatian prison officers received, at the airport, the two men Croatia had once rewritten a law to protect. Croatian law has no life sentence, so the German sentences had to be converted, and two different county courts did the arithmetic. Perkovic's life became 30 years. Mustač's life, for the same crime and the same German verdict, became 40. No one has convincingly explained the difference. Croatian legal commentators called it inexplicable. Perković becomes eligible for parole around 2028. Mustač around 2034, when he would be 92. In 2022, a group of retired generals, among them Ante Gotovina, the most celebrated soldier in the country, petitioned Croatia's president to pardon them both. Germany signaled that pardoned men would be demanded back into German custody. President Milanović let the petition die on his desk. In November 2025, Josip Perković, 80 years old, was escorted out of Glina prison for a day to bury his wife. 200 people came to stand with him. Both men are in Glina still. Which leaves the garage's last question. 3 accounts exist of who did the killing, and not one has ever been tested to a verdict. The German investigator's oldest suspicion, never charged, is Sindacic himself. He has always denied it. Sindacic's own sworn answer named Bijelic, who died untried, and Sekula, who lives in Sweden, and whom Sweden has never handed over. The Arkan story, told by a former officer over a video link, was examined by the court and rejected. Emigre chroniclers keep a 4th list of Belgrade underworld names that died young and violently, tested in no court at all. Every version has believers. None has a verdict. The file has not even stopped moving. In March 2025, Croatian state prosecutors closed a 12-year investigation into whether Sindacic had lied under oath about Perković and Mustač. Their conclusion: no evidence that his statements were false. 2 weeks later, from inside Glina prison, Perković and Mustač filed to take over the prosecution themselves as private parties. The 2 men convicted of organizing the murder, petitioning to put the state's chief surviving witness on trial for lying about them. That application is still pending. 42 years on, the men of Operation Dunav are still in court, arguing over who is allowed to speak. The family kept paying long after the funeral. Damir Đureković, the son who crossed an ocean because he feared the service's reach, was found dead in Calgary on the 10th of September 1987. He was 33. The Canadian authorities ruled it a suicide. The exiles who knew him have disputed that ruling for 4 decades, pointing out that he had just been planning to finish his father's last books. The ruling has never changed. Gisela carried the case all the way to the Munich verdict and died in Zagreb in 2021. In December 1999, Stjepan Đureković was exhumed from his Munich grave and reburied at Mirogoj Cemetery in Zagreb, home with the verdict still 17 years away. The garage at Sauerlacher Strasse No. 1 is still there. An ordinary Bavarian backyard, an ordinary door, an ordinary lock. Somewhere in the surviving paperwork of a dead state, or in a memory in Sweden, or nowhere at all anymore, is the name of the man who took a copied key from a handler's palm and waited in the dark for the man who trusted the door. Every court is finished except the one that never started, the trial of the hand that held the blade. The courts named the men who ordered the murder of Stjepan Đureković, and they named the friend who opened the door. They never named the hands that carried it out. 3 stories compete: the suspect who has always denied it, the 2 names he swore to, and the warlord a court refused to believe. Which do you find credible? And the harder question, a chancellor's empty chair, a rewritten law, 3 days before a country joined Europe. Why did the answer take 33 years? Say what you think in the comments. If cases like this one belong in your Saturdays, subscribe and turn on notifications. Eastern Files opens another case next week. Some doors are never forced. Some doors are simply opened by someone trusted with the key.